As Fabio said, I have just actually completed a world tour. My responsibilities are for all of international, for LoyaltyOne, and I've just come off a world tour that started actually in Brazil. I went Brazil, Mexico, Turkey, Singapore, India, London, Dallas, and back to Brazil. So what I wanted to share with you today was some of our global loyalty learnings in terms of what's happening in loyalty across the world and what that might mean to loyalty operators in Brazil. But before we get started, it's probably worth just clarifying what do we mean by loyalty. And by loyalty, I don't just mean points programs. It's broader than that. It's about all of the activities that we as marketers take to take our customers from awareness to advocacy. And I'm going to use an example. Let's pretend, everybody, that this is a bottle of Coke for lack of anything else. And let me show you an example of what I mean. I actually tried, with the help of Google Translator, to try and put that in Portuguese, so it might be a little more helpful. So awareness is very simply the fact that I've heard of the brand. And going back to my Coke example, Coke spends billions of dollars a year to make sure that I have heard of Coke. Attitude is that I have a positive attitude to the brand. And again, that's where Coke marketing comes in. The next stage, though, is trial, which is it's a marketer's job to make sure that I actually try the brand. So my first can of Coke. That stage after that is to have some regular activity, so some buying activity. And then to get you to spend more, so buy a case of Coke or buy it more often. Then it's to get you to buy other products like Diet Coke. And then it's, at that point, one could say that you are a regular buyer. And that's your transactional behavior, followed by getting you to be emotionally connected to the brand, which means you have both my heart and my behavior. And finally, when I'm fully engaged, I start telling all my friends, you should be buying Coke because this is such a great brand. And then at the very end, you get advocates, sort of those crazy people who start a website dedicated to Coke. So it actually looks more like a funnel that you might have, for every 1 million people for whom you build awareness, you might have 10 crazy people who are advocates for the brand. But really, the work of loyalty marketers, that's the job of marketing. The work of loyalty marketers is very specifically to take your customers from trial to loyalty. I would say all of the mass marketing efforts are really about building awareness and attitude to the brand. And a lot of the customer experience efforts are about building customer advocates over time. But the business of loyalty starts with getting a customer in the store with a name. And from that name, building their relationship to a point where they become a profitable repeat buyer. And that's the behavior change that loyalty needs to drive. So with that understanding, that exercise manifests itself traditionally in 3 models. There have always been sort of 3 models that have dominated the loyalty scene. The first is proprietary. So proprietary is one program, one retailer, one currency, one type of points. You often see this in specialty retail. So the retailer sets up shop, they issue a kind of points, and those points are given to their customers, and the only thing that those customers can redeem is merchandise in their store. Now that's a proprietary program, and the kilometers example is maybe the most current one here in Brazil, but I'm sure there are many others. The second is a partner program, and frequent flyer programs are often the best example of a partner program because they use their unused seats on a plane essentially to create a reward that many other brands can then use, they can buy into. So if I go and rent a car today, I could have 22 different reward programs or different kinds of currencies that I could choose to collect when I go and rent that car. You often see partner programs in the travel category, hotels, banking, and flight are probably the most current. And you will see a little bit of overlap between coalition and partner programs, but generally the thing about partner programs is they can be bought by conversion. So I might be collecting one kind of points at the retailer, but I can convert to something else. Or I can be collecting partner points with my credit card. The third model is coalition. And the easiest way to think about coalition is to think about it, if you imagine the EU, and there are many countries, they all speak a different language, they all have different customs, but they all collect in those countries, they all use a common currency called the euro. And the reason for having one currency across all those geographies is it makes life very, very simple for the people who need to cross borders on a regular basis. The same thing is true of coalition. It's one currency across all the categories of non-discretionary spend where a customer shops. So fuel and retail and banking and credit card and telco. And as a result, the consumer accumulates that one currency much more quickly. And what we know is that when a consumer gets a reward quickly, they will change their behavior. And it's the fastest way to get them to change behavior and ultimately deliver financial performance to the brand. But for the longest time, those were the only models, really, that loyalty operators could choose from. But now the world has changed, partly because of mobile, but partly because the models are morphing and changing as we speak. There are hundreds now of different loyalty models out there, and that makes certainly your role more complicated to figure out the right model for your vertical. A couple of popular ones, I won't talk about all of them, is fuel rollback. So fuel rollback is a very popular model in the US at the moment. It's just coming to Canada. We haven't seen it anywhere else globally. It's not really in Europe yet, although I hear it's coming. 58 out of 71 fuel retailers in the US are doing fuel rollback. And very simply, it is you collect the points at the grocer, and the grocer gives you a discount that you can then take to the fuel retailer to get cents off your fuel purchase. And that benefits the grocer in that they're creating a reward for their grocery customers, and it benefits the fuel retailer because they're getting customer acquisition. Now, the reason it's called fuel rollback is because when it was first launched by actually Excentis, they had licensed a technology where the price actually rolled back at the pump, which is very cool. It's kind of like those Walmart commercials where you see the price go down. Then other retailers got into it without the technology, and now it's simply become a coupon-based model. Now, it drives quite a bit of profitability. Grocers generally, at first launch, they might see even a 5 to 10% lift. Fuel retailers might see as much as a 10 to 20, 30% lift, but it's very short-lived because if you think about it now, every one of those 58 retailers in the US is offering exactly the same dividend to their customers. So there's no differentiation. Another very popular model is daily deals. I'm sure all of you have heard of Groupon or Living Social, and it's essentially a discount. It's a discount program. The first generation was mass-oriented, so it offered discounts to everybody, whether you were interested or not, and it created such a lot of irrelevant communications that essentially consumers backed down and started opting out of those offers. But we are seeing that model morph into a much higher relevancy model as those operators start to use customer data. The third probably important model here is merchant-funded networks or merchant-funded offers. Those were originally started mostly in the network and banking business, and it came principally because interchange is going down globally, and where credit cards used to be able to fund their loyalty programs out of interchange, now they're looking at alternative models. And what they do is they borrow the value from the merchant. So not dissimilar from the fuel model, the credit card invites their customers, if they have that credit card, to get discounts at a retailer. So the retailer is actually fronting the discount, and they're getting the acquisition value that comes from the credit card, and the credit card doesn't have to fund a reward, especially in Asia. In Asia, I would say probably the ratio of points offers to discount offers is probably 80-20. So in Singapore, every time you turn around, there are discount offers for everything, or there are points that are immediately convertible to discounts. And the last model I do want to point out is what we call mom and pop programs. Those are interesting, I think, for Brazil, because where organized retail is maybe only 50% of all retail, in other parts of the world, like India, it's less than 10%. In Singapore, it would maybe be 30%. So that means that there are many small retail formats. And before this time, they never really had an opportunity to create loyalty with their customers unless they had a one-to-one relationship with their customers who were local, who lived around the corner and came in every day. But now with capabilities like 5-Star and Kickback and Zavvi and even Square, those operators, those very small retailers, now have available and inexpensive technology for them to capture a customer name and start to communicate to those customers on a one-to-one or on a segmented basis, the way large retailers have been able to do. So that's an important strategic advantage that small retailers are now going to have that wasn't true 5 years ago. So let me talk a little bit about what we've seen in terms of the changing loyalty landscape sort of the world over. Now, what I'd like you to think about is there may be three different types of global operators. There are what I call early stage loyalty operators. I would describe the Philippines, Malaysia, India, really nascent markets. And they're nascent markets for a couple of reasons. One is that they're underpenetrated in organized retail, so they really don't have enough transaction frequency and lift-in spend to fund a program. And they don't have the basic infrastructure for data capture and one-to-one targeting. Then there are what I would call developing loyalty markets. That would definitely be Turkey, as an example. Turkey has probably as sophisticated a payments platform as the UK would have, but still underpenetrated in terms of their loyalty activity. Turkey would be Hong Kong, China, and maybe even Brazil would be in that same bucket. And then I talk about mature markets would be North America, definitely the UK, the US, and Canada, but most definitely the US, which is, I would say, not just a mature loyalty market, but an overly saturated loyalty market. And the first example of that is if you think about loyalty penetration and consumer engagement. So in an emerging or an early stage loyalty market like Singapore, they would have, on average, consumers would participate in 2 to 3 programs. In Turkey and Brazil, as an example, and even in Canada to some extent, consumers would participate in 5 to 10 loyalty programs. In the US, the latest loyalty census, consumers participate in 22 programs, which is incredible. But on the flip side, what you should know is that they are only 50% engaged. So they are engaged in less than 10 programs on average. And actually that 50% engagement rate is true for all geographies. So whether you're looking at early stage markets, mid stage markets, or mature markets, very few markets have been able to lift customer engagement beyond 50% of their base. So don't be worried if you operate a program and you find that only 50% of your customers are really changing your behavior. That's the norm. Now, what I will say is that generally retail programs are higher. So I've seen retail programs in some geographies as high as 65% of their customers are actively engaged, collecting, redeeming, lifting their spend, increasing their frequency. Generally, the lowest engagement we see in online retail and in frequent flyer and travel programs. And that's largely because the usage of those programs is much lower. In terms of players and the dividend, what we're seeing is in mature markets, it's actually much more focused on credit and retail. So in the US, Canada, and Europe, the large players are almost entirely credit and retail players of various kinds, with some services. You'll see some B2B programs, mostly for small business. But actually, in some of the early stage and developing loyalty markets, we're seeing some very interesting new players come into the loyalty space. That includes entertainment. So in Singapore, 2 out of the 3 largest entertainment companies are involved in loyalty programs. And they have a great asset, which is content that they're bringing to their loyalty programs. They can do one-to-one recipes and fashion recommendations, so they have communication channels to talk to their customers, and they have something to say. Other important categories that are coming into loyalty are transportation. So we're seeing EasyLink, the ability to get loyalty on your subway pass, on your bus pass, on your even on your ferry tickets. Telecom is an important new category. I would have said 5 years ago, there isn't a single successful telecom loyalty program in the world. That's no longer the case. Actually, in Turkey, Turkcell is probably the world's most successful telecom program. They have 40 million out of 75 million, only 75 million people in Turkey, and they have 40 million subscribers, most of whom are engaged in some way in their loyalty program. So truly a successful model. And the other emerging categories, and we've done a lot of this work in Canada, are recycling and healthcare. So we're seeing a lot of use of loyalty for healthcare, for patient adherence, to get patients to use and take their drugs and actually go to the doctor more often, become more healthy, diet, those types of things. Talking about some of the other changes, I would say in terms of goals, they are different from one geography to the other. I would say in some of the early stage markets, they're using loyalty fundamentally to drive mass awareness. When you're growing your retail markets, again at 8 to 10% every year, you're less focused on one-to-one. Whereas in a mature market like the US, the only way you grow your market is by stealing share from your competitor. And so the use of loyalty in an early stage market versus a saturated market like the US is fundamentally different. You need to steal share. And so in the US and Canada, loyalty is very, very focused on differentiation. I must have a proposition that nobody else can equal. We're not seeing that in every market. Finally, when I talk about data usage and channels, I'd say most loyalty operators the world over are all trying to collect data from their customers. I'd say the more mature markets have understood that their customers are not going to fill out an application with 18 points of data in order to collect a card. And so the more mature operators are asking them just one point of data, and then they have a staged data collection process over time. And I think Starbucks is probably the best example of that. They put a card in your hand before they ask you anything. And they get some level of customer engagement and frequent behavior, and then they start to build on the data collection and create more relevancy over time. And finally, actually, I did just want to say one thing on channels. So the biggest constraint that's different from west to east is that in North America and Europe, they have one-to-one channels. The penetration of email is 100% in those markets. And so they can truly, with the right data, have a one-to-one conversation with each and every customer. That is not the case in Eastern markets, where email penetration is maybe 30%, SMS is very expensive and hard to reach, and there are lots of government controls. So we're seeing the real challenge for some of the markets in the East is even if I have all the data to be able to talk to my customers one-to-one, I don't have the channels to actually deliver those actionable messages to change the behavior. So, what, in summary, are some of the key conclusions that I had from my trip? Actually, one last point. In all those markets, we did do customer research, and it was interesting to find that customers, East and West, all said exactly the same thing. And their biggest complaint is, I want a better value proposition, and I'd like a faster time to reward. So as I talked about earlier, customers do the math, and customers have figured out, whether it's in Singapore or Istanbul or Bombay, they have figured out that if I have to wait 3 months to get, a bottle of Coke or, a free shopping bag, that isn't enough of a reward for me to change behavior. And where that becomes a problem is that in a lot of markets, we're seeing the dividend go down. So where the average dividend, which is what you invest in your loyalty program, in a mature market like North America, credit card dividend is between 1.5% to 2%. For best customers, might even be higher than that. For retailers, it's usually 1 to 1.2, and that's a combination of base points and a lot of bonusing. So 0.5% is what they're investing in loyalty programs. You can do the math. If they invest 0.5%, the customer is getting very little reward. The customer figures out the reward isn't enough to make them change behavior. And so you see a cycle of programs that aren't fundamentally delivering the financial performance that they should be delivering. So, in conclusion, what do we see? We're seeing that multi-motivators are emerging for most programs around the world. So most operators have figured out that their customers need a combination of motivators. If you're in a coalition, you would have a broad reward set. So you're giving your customers essentially multi-motivators to choose from, anything from flight to grocery discounts to other types of things. But if you're a single operator, you might want to look at offering them points plus discounts plus something else. So Migros, the second largest grocer in Turkey as an example, they've changed their loyalty program to include every 6 weeks they do a different cycle of merchandise rewards, and then they do discount rewards, and then they do points promotions. So that variety is what they find changes their customer behavior and delivers the financial performance. What we're also seeing in terms of creating customer relevance in geographies where customers or operators have data, but they have no direct channels, they are using the data that they collect from their customers to drive mass or segmented customization. That means that they're actually using the data to change their mass media approach, and that's a great way to bring their customers in. What we're also seeing is to create customer relevance, they're moving from push, which is just driving a bunch of messages, undifferentiated messages, out to their customers. They're using the data plus a differentiated reward. I know that you're, a working mother versus I know that you're a frequent flyer. I'm going to, based on that data, I change the reward, and I therefore drive pull communications, where I invite you to come and participate because I give you a promotional offer that you can't refuse, and using that data effectively to drive that. In terms of loyalty performance, the road I see ahead for most operators in this room, and actually in global markets, most loyalty operators start with a loyalty program just to engage, to do brand engagement. But as you become more sophisticated in your loyalty efforts, campaign response becomes the most important measure. And then it goes to program ROI, which I would say is really a sophisticated loyalty operator should be giving you a program ROI on the loyalty points that you're distributing. And finally, when your loyalty program is actually feeding the rest of the organization, so changing the way you price your products, changing the way you might do your product assortment, or you might work with your vendors, then you truly have an enterprise ROI. And those would really be best-in-class programs are moving in that direction. Multi-partner solutions, what we're seeing is when operators have not enough dividend to invest, they are getting together with other partners so that they can get shared assets, whether it's media companies joining with telecoms. Telecoms have a base. I was just in a meeting last week with Vodafone in India. They have 150 million customers, but they have nothing to say to them. Media companies have content, but they have no customer relationship. So what we're seeing is companies get together to create loyalty partnerships. And just to close off in terms of how those partnerships work, we as media companies, or loyalty companies, essentially, we operate on two axes. Those two axes are spend and frequency. So if you think about driving basket size, I either increase how much you put in your basket, or I increase the number of times you come into my store. Those are the two metrics that drive financial performance. So if you think about the loyalty landscape, there are brands or verticals that essentially are high spend but low frequency. That includes flight, medicine, certainly healthcare. You only go to the doctor once a year. Most people only get on a plane once a year, if that. Hotels and luxury items. So those are very high spend, but not enough frequency. And that's often where you see frequent flyer programs live, at that top segment of the population. Now, the top segment might get on a plane twice a year, but there's certainly, unless they're traveling on business every week like I am, that is not a regular high-frequency category. Then on the other end of the spectrum, you have low spend and high-frequency categories like telecom and fuel. And so in those categories, what you see is promotional programs. Generally, because it's low frequency, they give you a very small reward, but they see you and can talk to you and have an option to communicate to you all the time. I fill up my car once or twice a week. If I'm in a prepaid market, I'm loading up my phone at least once a week, if not more often than that. Then in the middle, you have retail. And retail is often where we see proprietary programs. If you're in specialty retail, depending on the market you're in and clothing, you might get a frequency of three times a year, 5 times a year. If you like fashion, it might be 12 times a year, 15 times a year, but generally the frequency is never going to be as high as it will be on fuel or telco. Grocery would most certainly be higher than specialty retail. And that's often where proprietary programs live. But the problem with proprietary programs is they have neither the high spend nor the high frequency to be able to drive a meaningful reward to their customers. And that makes it problematic because the customer has figured out, if I don't get a meaningful reward, that card is going to go from the front of my wallet to the back of my wallet, and I will no longer be one of those most engaged customers. And then finally, you have credit card and debit card, those bank, network, merchant-funded programs. They sort of sit in the middle. And quite frankly, they'll play with frequent flyer. You see a lot of relationships between credit cards having frequent flyer as a reward option to the credit card customers. They'll play with merchants and do merchant-funded offers. They'll really play with anybody and leverage their relationships, their customer relationships, to increase card usage. But really, when you think about the partnership space, the coalition model is a means by which you capture both the high spend of some categories, the high frequency of other categories, and the high sort of customer relationships that people have in the retail sector. And you capture all of that in one model. And so what happens there is each of the verticals in the model is able to leverage the other to get both increased interest, usage, and frequency. And I think the best example of this, I'm just wrapping up, is this is an example from Supernoso. Actually, this is a test that they did. They're a regional grocery leader, if you don't know, from Belo Horizonte. And This is just an example of a test pre-period to post-period before they launched Coalition to after. So in the pre-period, they were almost 5% under the market in terms of their grocery performance. In the post-period, the 9 to 12 months following, they were 7.5% over the market. And really, that's what we mean when we say that awareness to advocacy, driving financial performance, these are the types of financial results that loyalty operators should be looking for. And I often say that loyalty operators, we're not answerable to the CFO, to the CMO, we're answerable to the CFO. The CFO ultimately, if it's not in year 1, by year 2 or year 3, the CFO takes a walk down the hall to the CMO, Chief Marketing Officer, and says, where's my ROI? How is this thing making money for me? And if it isn't, generally we see that that's where operators start to reduce their dividend. So, key takeaways. Multi-motivators, look at expanding your reward portfolio. Customer relevance, look at multi-channel and mass customization to increase the relevance of your messaging to your customers so that they will be engaged with you. And partnerships and coalition, look at creating and sharing and trading customer value. With that, thank you.